right. Thank you all so much for being here. And it's really wonderful to be in the room with Glen Loveland and Joanna Choi Kalbus. Really excited to introduce you to this episode of Serica Storytellers, and we're really fortunate to be partnered with Korean American Story on this event. So thank you so much for your partnership and for all your support. Very briefly, my name is Daniel Tam-Claiborne. I'm the Deputy Director of the Serica Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to amplifying the impact of the Asian diaspora in America through storytelling, empowering, and convening. And we've got a couple of great events coming up. I just wanted to quickly highlight before we dive in here. So, before the end of the year wraps, we've got a second iteration of Serica Storytellers on Tuesday, December 2nd. That's going to be live in person in New York, 6:30 Eastern Time at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, which will be featuring two university presidents, David Wu, who's the president of Baruch College, and Frank Wu, no relation, the president of Queens College. They'll be exploring how student visa revocations are shaping CUNY campuses, immigrant communities, and New York's educational landscape. We're just talking Glenn and I a little bit earlier about the the trials and tribulations of working in academia. So this will be a nice purview into that world for folks who are based in New York. We'd love to see you there. And then finally, December 4th, this one's open to everyone, a virtual holiday giving appreciation campaign meetup, which will happen at 12:30 p.m. Eastern over Zoom. Get to meet all of us here at Serica, talk more about what we have in store for 2026, and share your ideas so that we can serve the community even better. So, again, thank you all so much for being here. It's really such a privilege. And thank you, Joanna and Glenn. I'm just going to share a little bit about you both and then take us all through what we're expecting here for the hour together. So, very briefly, Joanna Choi Kalbus was born in North Korea. She made two critical migrations, first from North Korea to South Korea after the communist takeover, and then to the US as a 10-year-old immigrant during the Korean War before settling in and coming of age in Los Angeles. She earned her BA in elementary education at UCLA and received her PhD in educational administration from the University of California, Riverside. She served as a teacher, principal, and assistant superintendent for 35 years and has always been involved in community organization and engagement. Now retired, she lives in the Bay Area, where she can view her favorite bridge, the Golden Gate, where she and her mother sailed under back in 1951. Thank you so much, Joanna. And with us also here this afternoon and evening is Glen Loveland, Senior Career Coach at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. For over a decade, Glen was based in Beijing, working for multinational firms including Pearson and the Walt Disney Company. He made history as the first foreigner hired as an HR manager by China's state broadcaster CCTV, where he spearheaded expat recruitment across their English, Arabic, French, Spanish, and Russian media outlets. He also studied Mandarin at the Beijing Language and Cultural University. His firsthand experiences navigating the complexities of China's talent landscape are captured in his debut memoir, Beijing Bound, A Foreigner Discovers China, which we'll, of course, will be talking about today. So again, thank you both so much. I am going to cede the floor to you both to share a little bit about your books. So we'll hear first an excerpt from Joanna, and then an excerpt from Glenn, and then we'll jump into questions. For folks who are watching, please keep those questions percolating because we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So I'll go ahead and stop talking and hand things over to Joanna. Joanna, thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to Serica Initiative and Korean American Story for hosting me. And thank you, the audience, the invisible audience. I wish I could see you in person. I'm an old school. I'm going to do an excerpt on the title of the book, The Boat Not Taken, but because that is a turning point of our lives, my mother and I. One morning, when we stepped outside, the sun was so bright, I shielded my eyes with my right hand. A perfect day for an outing. I held Omai's hand and skipped to keep up with her fast pace. Along the way, I pinched my nose when a weather-beaten dung man passed by, balancing on his bony shoulders a long bamboo stick with a bucket full of human waste at each end of the pole. He teetered, so heavy was his load. Although I couldn't smell the contents, I heard the slush, slush, slurping sound with his every step. From the comfort of riding on her back, I asked, "Where are we going, oh my?" She stopped and turned her head to the left to catch my gaze, and I stretched my neck and tilted my head to face her. "We're going to visit the nuns. You remember them from our church in Unir, don't you? You're going to stay with them for a little while. I saw only my mother's profile. I heard the word chokom. I would be staying with the nuns a little while. On her back, so close to her, I could hear her breathing. Staying at the convent for a little while didn't seem too bad. Besides, I didn't have to worry about it at that moment, since it would be much later in the day, way in the future. We arrived at a large building in another section of the city. I didn't know how to read the sign above the entrance. My mother rang the bell. I held her hand as we stood at the door. A woman wearing a black flowing garment with a string of beads wrapped around her waist for belt opened the door. How are you, Mother Superior? My mother said and bowed. Do come in. This must be your daughter. They talked for a few minutes. I looked around. Sister Maria was to be my surrogate mother. She took my mother and me to a large room that housed the girls. I was to be one of them. This was where I'd be staying. I swallowed a gob of saliva. My mother handed kerchief bundle to Sister Maria. I hadn't even noticed the small pouch until that moment. The nun placed it inside an empty cubbyhole. That must be my clothes, I thought. I didn't ask, but I made sure I'd memorized where the bundle was. I didn't like the situation, and yet it was my mother who brought me here. It must be all right. Nevertheless, I held onto her hand firmly. The time came for my mother to say goodbye. She crouched down to face me. I will come back for you as soon as I can. You know that, don't you? I know. I wanted to shout that I didn't want to stay here. I wanted to grab her and cry, please don't leave me. Instead, I lowered my head and looked down at the pleats of my skirt. You're a very smart girl. Mind the sisters, my mother said, folding my hands in hers. Come back soon, oh my. I will be waiting. These words came out of my mouth like a parrot's words. My cold hands were enclosed within Omai's warm hands. In the evening, I'd wait until each girl was settled in her cot and the nun in charge closed the door to our room. In the darkness, I heard a girl singing and the big girl next to me breathing through her mouth. I held my soft bundle to my chest. Tears streamed down my face, but I kept my mouth shut so that the shuddering sounds from deep inside of me could not escape. I wonder where my mother was at that moment. Was my oh my far away, like the sound of the train whistle I heard each night? In the quiet of the night, the train too seemed to be crying. Finally, my mother did come back for me. Are we going home, oh my? I asked with my face buried in her blouse. Yes, we are going home, she said as she picked me up and held me. We went to the boat dock. My mother found a boat scheduled to leave that day. We queued up. All the others in line were men. When my mother's turn came, she tried to book passage to North Korea. Became frightened when the man in charge started shouting at my mother. Woman, are you out of your mind? He said. Most people in North Korea are desperately trying to flee from there. And here you are trying to go back. She slapped my mother across her face and yelled, Get out of here. Don't you ever try this again. My mother's left hand flew to her face, protecting herself from the sting of his slap. The ticket agent spat and shouted, Next. I think my time is up, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I just want to keep listening. Thank you so much for sharing that excerpt. And now we'll go over to Glenn to share a little bit from Beijing Bound.
I was just going to say, having read Joanna's book, that is just a snippet of what you're going to find in her beautifully written memoir. It's an amazing book. Daniel, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Serica Initiative for this opportunity, as well as Korean American Story. And I was very excited that they were supporting this webinar because When I arrived in Beijing in 2007, the Korean diaspora in Beijing was huge. The number of Korean companies operating in Beijing, the number of Korean expats working in the city, including students there studying Mandarin. The relations between South Korea and China were very strong. And as it turned out, my very first roommate and colleague at my new company in Beijing in 2007 was a Korean American. So I thought I would read this snippet about her. Her name is Scarlett, and I had been in Beijing less than 24 hours at this stage, and I'm waiting for Scarlett. I glanced up from my guidebook again, peering out the window of the cozy apartment. Though it looked brisk outside, I was snug with the heat cranked up high, so high that I'd slipped into shorts and a tank top. Scarlett was set to arrive any minute. As eager as I was to have a roommate in this foreign city, trepidation lurked. Eventually, I would crave my own freedom. I came here to immerse myself in the culture and make Chinese friends, not transplant my American life. From what I could tell, Scarlett and I were vastly different people. She seemed like she was brimming with youthful enthusiasm that bordered on being naive at times. Meanwhile, I was a world-weary politico taking a break from the cynical DC bubble. For better or worse, Scarlett was my new roomie. We'd have to find some common ground if we were going to make this odd couple pairing work. I heard Scarlett's voice through the thin walls as she chatted with the driver, clearly asking if I was there. A gentle knock followed, and I opened the door to find her beaming face. She immediately threw her arms around me in an enthusiastic hug as the driver looked on approvingly. You must be exhausted from your trip, I said after she released me. Why don't you shower and rest a bit first? No way, Scarlett replied, already unzipping her suitcase. Let me just grab a warmer coat and we can hit the streets. It's way colder here than New York. I frowned slightly, but aren't you jet lagged? I'm fine, she insisted, zipping up a puffy down jacket. I can't wait to explore Beijing, and I'm starving. Let's get some food first. In our calls leading up to this, Scarlett's energetic personality had shown through. She barely paused for breath between sentences. Optimism seemed to radiate from her as she chattered about working in China for a year before grad school, like an extended gap year abroad. Having relatives in South Korea was an added bonus for her. Some of Scarlett's friends had warned her about what she might encounter here. Since she had an Asian face, people would assume she spoke Mandarin. There was a chance some Chinese folks would insult her for being with me, a white foreigner, instead of with her own kind. Interracial couples still raised eyebrows in East Asia, apparently. And she might face ridicule for being overweight in a culture obsessed with thinness. As if all that wasn't enough, Scarlett's American upbringing meant people could get offended that she didn't embrace Asian culture more. I felt bad that such prejudices existed, but Scarlett didn't seem worried in the slightest. She brushed off the warnings with optimism, insisting we would be fine if we minded our own business. Though Scarlett didn't speak Mandarin, her frequent trips to Korea meant that she was far more relaxed in Asia than I was. She recognized more cultural norms, had insider knowledge of East Asian societies, and generally seemed in tune with the region. Without Scarlett, I doubt I could have survived those first few weeks in Beijing. She became an indispensable guide for me. We decided to grab some lunch, and I was going to show Scarlett how to take the bus. But given the sudden turn in the weather, we opted to walk instead. An ominous brown fog had settled in overnight, obscuring the buildings that yesterday had been clearly visible. It was an eerie, murky scene. I lamented the poor timing. Scarlett's first day, and she could barely see 2 feet in front of her. The fog lifted just in time for us to spot an ornate pavilion tucked away in Longtan Park near our apartment. We paused at the carved wooden door emblazoned with calligraphy reading Private Club, our first foray without local guides, and we already faced uncertainty as to whether we'd even be allowed into this elegant bastion. Around us, the parking lot glittered with Ferraris, Rolls Royces, and other luxury vehicles that hinted at the clientele within. Clearly, this restaurant was the haunt of Beijing's elite. Two hostesses in cheap-how gowns opened the imposing doors to greet us as we approached the entrance. They immediately addressed Scarlett in rapid Mandarin, naturally assuming she was a native. Her tinkling laugh and helpless "对不起, sorry, made them pause and reassess this odd foreign pair before them. With polite smiles, they ushered us inside to a lovely table by the window. Only one menu arrived, presented to Scarlett, the server deducing that I was the guest. Later, I learned this was customary for the host to receive the menu and to only one person to order for everyone. But for now, we simply shrugged and fumbled through the elaborate menu together. Luckily, photos accompanied each dish, a boon for illiterates like us. We ordered liberally: juicy pork and leek dumplings with soy garlic dipping sauce, an unfamiliar but enticing duck dish, and warming soup. Fragrant green tea arrived, leaves drifting poetically, delectable cashews too, and one mystery plate. Some alien sea creature? Scarlett gasped, hands flying to her mouth. It's chicken feet. Indeed, four yellow claws leered up at us. Scarlett prodded one hesitantly. I stifled a shudder, plastering on a polite smile. We would simply have to be adventurous. The Peking duck, Cao Ya, arrived next. Scarlett navigated her chopsticks with precision, plucking aromatic morsels of duck with graceful movements honed through years of practice. As steam rose gently from the lacquered skin, she gestured for me to mimic her mastery. My clumsy hands fumbled with the smooth sticks. Scarlett's smile radiated encouragement as she gently adjusted the angle of the sticks in my grip. After further struggles, I finally claimed a small victory, grasping a sliver of duck and delivering its rich flavors to my tongue. Scarlett nodded approvingly as I savored the complex blend of spices. Though my chop skills remained an amateur imitation of Scarlett's, it offered a window into her Asian American tradition.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Glenn. And thank you so much, Joanna. So much of both of your memoirs really resonated with me. Joanna, you of course you mentioned the double migration that you and your family undertook, and my mom actually she was herself the product of a kind of double migration from China first, then to Cuba, and then eventually to the United States. And of course, Glenn, I spent really formative years in my young adulthood living and working in China, including in Beijing, from about 2009 to 2017, some years, on and off during that time period. And so very much can resonate with those experiences of sort of befriending people and sort of these like odd pairings and the perceptions that are seen by locals and confusion that arises inevitably. So I was really touched by both of your works. So I just want to start by jumping into talking about migration, this sort of force that really compels you both in these quests for livelihood and self-interrogation and reinvention and purpose. And so, of course, thinking about you, Glenn, first, your migration is a little bit more existential. This idea that you were working in DC for a number of years, sort of wanting to undertake an experience that kind of took you out of that, sort of political pressure cooker realm and brought you into a different kind of set of experiences. And so seeing Beijing for the first time, being met with, this kind of almost awe, kind of inspiring sense of the potential of this new place and its openness. This was 2007, right before the Olympics. And then, of course, seeing over the course of, it sounds like 12 years that you were living there, what started as a 12-month maybe excursion that later became 12 years, change, of course, with the encroachment of autocracy and state control and all of the various compromises and trade-offs that you had to make since being there. So since you've been back in the States now, it sounds like since 2020, can you speak a little bit to the way that distance has informed the way you see and perceive contemporary China now?
It's a great question, Daniel, and I think that definitely just during that, that decade plus I was living there, seeing not only those changes in China, but even the ones back home in the States. It's fascinating watching your country when you're abroad and being like, what's happening over there? And do I relate to that anymore? A big thing that drove me wanting to write the book, I arrived back in the States in May 2020. And at that stage, the US was grappling with COVID. It was really bad. And US-China relations were at such a low point, that I really thought I want to capture what that moment was like in 2007 because it was, again, like you said, it was, a year before the Olympics in Beijing. And US-China relations they weren't great, but they were certainly better than what I encountered in 2020. And I thought, I really want to capture that and remember that for the future.
And thank you for that, Glenn. Joanna, your migration, of course, has a very different sort of valence. Your memoir traces forced migration, one in which your mother had to first escape Japanese occupied and then later war-torn Korea, followed by a flight to the US as refugees. So movement is less of a choice, but one that was really imposed as a means of survival. So can you talk a little bit about what it meant for you to, again, with the benefit of time, revisit that journey decades later, and to find your own life braided with that of your mother's?
Thank you. The questions that you have are very deep and thought-provoking. So uh, I had to write them down. So my answer to the questions about revisiting the escapes decades later and is that these escapes were before I was born. I heard my mother and later my big brother to tell me about glimpses of the family's life. Escape to China from Pyongyang in 1930 during the Japanese occupation of Korea. Another escape to Peking, 1932. It was just after the Japanese attack Manchuria. Once again, political upheaval has intruded in their personal lives. During my mother's lifetime, what I was able to piece together of my family's life in China was as crude as a child's painting. I did not understand these stories are braided into my own life events. It was decades later I realized that the events I always viewed as my mother's past is actually the foundation of my own. I began searching to understand my mother's stories and found pieces of my own. Daniel, when you say movement is not chosen but imposed by war and survival, I'd like to add that what I discovered in revisiting these escapes is that my mother had agency. She was not passive or helpless ragdoll in face of overwhelming events surrounding her. She had will and grit. She sized up the situation and made choices and acted upon them. Her resilience and grit got us through adversity. That is my inheritance. So much more to discuss about our historical forces, Japanese occupation, Korean War, Cold War division shape one family's life and its trajectory.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I think one thing that really resonated with both of your memoirs is really something that's also very core to Serica's mission is this question around belonging, and the search for belonging. I think that's true of immigrant communities, certainly within the U.S., but I think it's really true of anyone coming of age and trying to understand their place in the world. And so, of course, going back to you, Joanna, your memoir is kind of haunted by the absence of this kind of specter, North Korea, which only really exists through your mother's memories, and what, again, as you mentioned, have been able to piece together as this kind of historical relic. So how did you kind of determine, and I wonder about this a lot in terms of memoirs. This is not a genre that I write in, but what you choose to preserve and what you choose to reimagine, how you're able to shape a narrative that is so complex and so rich into something that is as compelling as and sort of and paced as well as a story.
My mother was born in 1905 and she died in 1996. When she died, I was 55 years old And during those years, 55 years, we lived together except for 3 years separation. I missed her so much, and I started communing with her. By that, I talked with her in my thoughts. Then I started journaling memories of our lives together. I wanted to preserve my mother's story. It was my way of grieving and healing. I had to reimagine her life story because I was before I was born, and that required researching the historical facts. Based on the historical facts as the background, I had to reimagine her personal narrative. For example, I interviewed my big brother about family's escape from Pyongyang to China when he was only 5 years old. The family had to escape to China after the the uncle killed a Japanese policeman during the Japanese occupation. I wrote the scene as if I were the omniscient narrator traveling with them, asking questions to myself about what, when did they cross the Tumen River, and how frightened they must have been knowing that if caught by the border patrol, they would have been killed or sent to Siberia. My heart pounded as I wrote the scene. As to translating her oral story into English, I intentionally inserted Korean words and dialogues with my mother as I thought it was more authentic than to anglicize. I think most readers will comprehend as there are context clues as well as bracketed English English in the story.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about language too, so we'll dig into that in just a minute. But I just want to turn back to Glenn. This idea about belonging in homeland. I think there's an often, an oft quoted thing about foreigners or expats in China that there's no way to reclaim a sense of home. You are this perpetual foreigner that, the way you look, the way you appear, the way you're treated. There's an impossibility of sort of finding a life there that feels sort of germane and organic in the way that locals and natives live. And so, of course, part of that is also the way in which your impression of Beijing changes over the course of the years that you spent there. Arriving as a stranger and then sort of leaving as, I think many of us do, sort of a little bit jaded and cynical, mourning a lost version of China that, we once found to be accessible. So in writing this memoir, again, you touched a little bit on your first answer, but did you feel like you were trying to preserve, again, sort of preserve in amber this period that no longer exists? And then, even now, how do you reconcile that search for a place and search for home, this affection for a city that doesn't resemble its former self any longer?
No, it's such a great question, Daniel, and I think you're right. I know when I first moved to Beijing, you kind of want to seek out the more experienced people, the people that have been there longer. And I remember chatting with some expats who, they lived in China a long time. They spoke fluent Mandarin. They married locals. They'd had babies. And they were like, it doesn't really matter how long you stay here. Like, you'll never be Chinese, Whereas I think in theory, the American experience being, an immigrant country is that, you can come to the States and eventually one day, hopefully, be considered American. So that was definitely true. But yeah, a lot of it, I mean, China had gone through so many changes, and that China of 2007, again, on the cusp of the Olympics, just such great potential. The sky was the limit. It felt like, and especially being an American who really had no experience in Asia at all, going there, it blew up so many of the stereotypes and preconceptions that I had, that I'd really wanted to write about China for a long time. And so when I started writing, I was like, I don't know where you start with this. And then I, you mentioned that you don't write memoir. I really took extensive diaries and journals my first few years in Beijing because I was just trying to process everything I was seeing and going through. So I had a lot of material I could actually go back to and be like, let's remember exactly what that period was like. Um, so that was the thing. I would say though, for all of those obstacles about belonging, um, I think as a foreigner, you also are welcomed in with a sense of hospitality that is hard to replicate elsewhere. And I remember that very, very well.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, they're really the warmth and the generosity that is afforded, I think, is just something so special and so unique to that opportunity. We like to believe that that's true of immigrants finding a home here in the U.S., but it just really isn't the same at all. And so that is really a special facet of that experience in China. I want to touch on language a little bit, and of course, kind of continuing on this idea about coming in as an outside observer to a culture, to a place. Of course, language acquisition is one of those things that is such a humbling experience, especially something to undertake as an adult. And so, Glenn, I'm curious, I myself kind of arrived in China in a similar way, having, not spoken the language of my mother growing up and therefore coming to China as kind of a mute deaf person, just trying to figure things out um and being constantly surprised and discouraged and all of the different range of emotions that come with that. And so how did your relationship with language change the way that you observe China? Of course, being able to gain more fluency perhaps provided access into different communities and different ways of understanding, and how did that journey shape the way you crafted your memoir?
It's so interesting because when I went back through those old journals, so much is about Mandarin. Like my
Yeah.
questions about the language and my frustration with learning and studying. I really wanted to be a good student. I invested a lot of time. I mean, most of my friends I met that first year were language exchange partners.
Mm,
Um, and it was kind of funny because in 2007 era China, Chinese people were obsessed with learning English. English was like considered really the lingua franca for them moving up in their careers, as well as an interest, American TV shows, Friends, Breaking Bad, Prison Break, things like that
okay.
were quite popular. And so there was a deep interest in the culture that way. I look at the AI tools we have today and I see like now I'm like, wow, you could arrive in any language, any country now. You don't need any language skills and you can get around without, hesitation. I'm still glad I went through that process because I think trying to study a language, it also teaches you a lot about the culture and the insights. And I would like study some of these phrases or idioms. And I would say to my Chinese friends, like, oh, this is an interesting insight into Chinese culture. And sometimes they were like, we hadn't even thought about that.
That's
So
right.
I was very glad that I did that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded a lot of Peter Hessler's, first book and sort of his process of going, crossing streets and going over bridges and writing down all the characters on the red banners and trying to translate them later. And I mean, yeah, what an experience, what an opportunity to be immersed in a place and come to learn so much about a country. Joanna, your experience is quite different, and I'm curious about if you can tell us a little bit about the hardship of kind of that inheritance, grappling with Korean oral storytelling from your mother and your own decision to retell them in English decades later. Can you speak a little bit about those linguistic choices in your memoir? And then also sort of this idea around the way you've chosen to also phoneticize or romanize the words that you place in the book as well as a kind of reclamation or a certain kind of agency as well.
I'm not sure about reclamation about my choice of orthography. Um, I Googled romanization of Korean, and there were five different romanizations.
Mm,
And as I put in my book, the note that I put for romanization of Korean orthography, Korean romanization changes depending on the front and back words, which is called word division. I only went to third grade in Korea when the war broke out, and there is no way that I would know how to do word division. So the best thing that I could do was to pronounce it, uh, uh, write it phonetically. So it might be my creation, but I think it works for me. Besides that, Busan is now Busan. Peking is now Beijing. And so uh, I hope my readers will forgive me for creating my own phonetic orthography, Korean. And yeah, to piggyback on Glenn's experiences, yeah, I have a sister-in-law who is a doctor, but and she speaks English, but it's like she one time the the patient came in and said, "Doc, my ass hurts." And then she says, "Excuse me." And then she went back to see the Korean dictionary. And then she came back and says, uh, "You need to go to veterinary hospital."
I see.
So,
Yeah.
so those things happen. And for the longest time, I thought I was doing the right thing by saying it's a doggy dog world. They finally, my
Oh,
son had the guts enough to say, it is not doggy dog world. It's dog eats dog. So there are problems in trying to acquire language. Uh,
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. Yeah, we all remember those mistakes that have haunted us. Absolutely. And yeah, thank you for sharing too. Just about sort of the decisions. I think, even learning a language as a young person, this is something I'm also fascinated by, the idea that sort of a native language could actually be superseded by a language that one learns in adulthood. This was certainly the case with my mother. Her first language was Spanish and then Toisanese, and she speaks neither of them as nearly as well as English at this point. So it's really fascinating to me how that what the mind is capable of and how important and how critical that environment is. I want to talk a little bit about identity, something also that's really core, I think, to both of your memoirs. Glenn as a gay man and a foreigner, shaping again this outsider status in a society that, by and large, then and of course, still now is very, very hierarchical, very socially conservative, slow to progress around issues, especially around sexuality. Can you speak to a little bit about, what it was like? I think this is an insight that I think is really quite unique, especially in the canon of American or Western or expat literature, especially as it relates to China, kind of providing a little bit of a window into this experience. And then also this idea that, maybe despite this sense of a separation or a dislocation from a homeland, this idea that I think you leave the reader with becoming part of a greater diaspora, united around identity, even after leaving Beijing. I was really, really fascinated by that.
Yeah, so Beijing Bound is about my first 12 months in China. And I do have, one chapter exclusively about kind of those gay experiences that I had there. And a lot of people, when they read it, they were like, we want more of this because they, like you said, it's kind of hard to find that. But I said, this is just about year one. I lived there more than a decade. I think what was really nice for me was definitely, I think it's the same as the States, right? What you're seeing in the news or what you're seeing from a political level might not match the idea of what's happening on the ground. And so I really did come in with these ideas of like, oh wow, Chinese people are going to be very conservative and against some of these things. And then it's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more nuanced. There are some, definitely beliefs about family and wanting to keep the family line going. That is very true and very important. But I think something I found really nice about the gay experience in China was I always found the gay experience in the States and really in a lot of Western societies a lot more cliquish, a lot more judgmental. That was not the case in China. The gay community really stuck together. The word for gay people in Mandarin is comrade. And it's that idea of we're kind of in this fight together. We're fighting against society. We're fighting against government. We're fighting against family. Like we've got to be in this together. And I always felt that during my experience there, which was just very different from what I had in the States. And I really appreciated that. And I learned a lot about myself, I would say, as a gay person by living in China.
That's fascinating. One kind of follow-up, which kind of dovetails a little bit, a question we've got from the audience too, is why bracket that experience to 1 year? And is there a sense of, is there a sort of a second memoir in the works that maybe details some of the other 11, or sort of just as an organizing principle, it was a little bit easier to wrap your hands around?
When I started writing, like a lot of first-time writers, you go into this not knowing really what you're doing. And I realized immediately, I was like, I have a lot of content. I have a lot of material. And so it just seemed to make sense to me that the first book be about year one, kind of that
Sure.
classic fish out of tail water. I am
Mm.
writing a follow-up now. It's a lot
Uh,
of work, as you know, as a writer. Um, hopefully it'll get done.
Fingers crossed. That's exciting. Really, really exciting. I'm glad to hear that. And Joanna, for you, I was curious, of course, the decision to write this memoir now, what storytelling and what the lineage that you're talking about in this book too, this, powerful lineage of Korean women, this resilience against all of these forces that, again, in spite of exerting an amazing amount of courageous agency, still fighting up against, these larger societal pressures of patriarchy and colonial violence, suppression of ideas, and freedom of expression. Why storytelling as the vehicle to do that, and how did you choose or desire to want to tell this particular story now?
Patriarchy is imprinted in Korean history and culture. Males are prized over females. In a chapter, one chapter in my book, where my second brother was taken in by distant relatives, and no one wanted to take in 5-year-old little girl, shows that patriarchy is still, well, everywhere. It's just that's what it is. Um, but and so I want to frame it from that assumption that patriarchy uh, is going to reign until I don't know when. So um, at the time that I was going to the first time I was going to title my book "The Legacy of Divided Land." But then
Hmm.
when I thought about it, it sounded too academic. Who wants to read a book with a colon after the title? So I broadened it to I made it into boat not taken, uh,
Hmm.
uh, because I felt that with my personal story that I could impact, um, be contribute to the writing world. So
Hmm.
I really think that storytelling is a powerful tool. For example, the chapter that I titled Manse, I chronicled my maternal grandfathers and my future mother's participation in March 1919 protests against Japanese tyranny.
Hmm.
It's a terrifying scene where the Japanese policeman dragged a young woman protester to the police station. stripped her clothes off, shoved a rubber hose between her legs, and turned on the water full force.
Mm,
Her insides burst. She died screaming.
mm.
This chapter is not fiction. It is first-hand account of a 14-year-old girl, a witness to this atrocity. Glenn, I'm glad that you're starting your second memoir because a writer can claim agency over history, especially in a memoir. So, so um, storytelling is important because it fosters connection, builds empathy, and helps us make sense of the world. By the way, manse, the word that she was saying, manse, in Korean is long live Korea.
Thank you for sharing that, Joanna. Are there plans in the works for a second memoir or fiction or other kinds of writing that you're currently working on as well?
Uh, I don't know if you noticed that there is a 37-year gap between part two to part three. And that is because it is my mother's memoir. I just happened to be with her for 55 years. So uh, I will write, I like to write, if I still have time, to write another memoir, but this one is going to be, I titled it in my mind, A Principle in America.
Mm,
Yeah,
I love that.
it's not easy to be a principal in America or climb up the the to the hierarchy. And
Mm.
so I like to share my experiences. So that's when I'll work on it.
I love that. No colons in the title. A Principal in America. I love it. And this is great. We can have you both on for
Oh,
your
there's
second
another
memoirs.
title that I'm
Yeah.
thinking of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. I was a principal where the Hells Angels uh,
Mm.
were my parents, right? And they come in and says, "Where's the Jap bitch?" So maybe I'll put that as a title.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Lots of possibilities. Yeah. Well, we're very excited to have you both back on Serica Storytellers for your second memoir. So I have one more question and then we'll kind of transition to the audience a little bit. But given the political climate we find ourselves in, I think, and this dovetails with the question around storytelling and its sort of import, and I think a lot of people, rightly so, question its value and its utility in a climate where freedom of speech is being impugned upon, and there are freedoms that are being stripped away, and there's, so many ways in which we as individuals can feel powerless in this machine. And so, what does resistance, broadly defined, look like for you, and how does art making, how does writing in particular feel like one of those tools in that resistance? So maybe start with you, Glenn. Thank you, Joanna.
I think we've got to stay on top of the news. You've got to know what's happening, but you can't let that totally detract you from focusing on what really matters and your long-term goals. And especially US politics, it's so short in a lot of respects compared to other places. We vacillate all the time. We're doing this today. What will we do tomorrow? Especially right now, that I think you just want to stay focused on the long term. I work with a lot of university students now, and I like to think that I'm making an impact that, on those students that could pay off for decades to come. So I would say pay attention to the news, but don't let it rule your life.
I like that. That's great advice. Thank you, Glenn. Joanna.
Yeah, I looked up the word resistance, and it says resistance is the act of withstanding or fighting against change. I prefer seeing resistance as standing your ground, to refuse to back down. We know that right now, right? Don't we? To refuse to back down.
That's right.
It also means to bravely facing frightening situation, just like the woman warrior who courageously stood her ground at March 1919
Mm,
independence protest. And to me, writing is a form of resistance because I am reclaiming my mother as an active, positive force standing against the Korean patriarchy and chaos and war. By
mhm.
giving me birth and by taking actions to ensure our survival, by including authentic Korean words and stories in the memoir. So
Mhm.
that is would be my form of resistance as a
Absolutely.
writer.
It
You
feels like a
also,
subversive act these days. So
Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off, Joanna.
Yeah, well, you also ask about the art making and writing.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, they are fundamental tools to communication and learning. To quote John Dewey, education is not preparation for life. Education is life.
Mm. I love that. I love that. Words to live by. Absolutely. Well, great. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. One that I see here is for both of you. So, the act of writing memoir relies deeply on memory and source material. Whether, Glenn, you mentioned, of course, this journals that you had copiously kept during your time in Beijing, and Joanna, in your case, interviews with family, oral history, oral storytelling. But of course, with memory, there's an inherent flaw in that in terms of its reliability. And so, how do you both reconcile the sort of transience and the mutability of memory when it comes to writing memoir? Or does it ultimately matter in the end, as long as the emotional truths feel resonant? Um, so maybe I'll start with you again, Glenn, and we'll jump back to Joanna.
I think definitely for memoir, the emotional truth, the core is the key thing. Technically, my book it actually kind of sits more in the travelogue section.
Mm,
And part of that is that because China changes so quickly, a lot of people who want to read memoirs about China, they are really looking for minute details. They want to know where that store stood, which street corners, how much the food cost, what they ate. Because, in Beijing, you can leave for 2 weeks, you come back, your neighborhood looks different, truly changes that fast.
yeah.
So I was really putting in a lot more detail than you might see in other books because I know when I've read memoirs about China, like you mentioned the Hessler books earlier, or Fuchsia Dunlop's book, Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, which is a great memoir.
Hmm.
That's what I'm looking for. I'm really looking for those details of that time and that era. So I
Yeah.
was maybe more obsessive over detail than you maybe need to be.
Hmm. That's interesting. And really interesting kind of artistic choice. I love that. I appreciate the specificity as well. One of the things I really admired about the book, the memoir slash travelogue. Joanna, how about for you?
Danielle, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. This idea about memoir being, sort of fallible in some ways. That how can we trust these things that happened in some cases, many decades ago? And ultimately, does it matter that the facts are all right, as long as the emotional truths feel real? Or is it really important to stick to the actual historical record?
It depends on the points of view as to which facts are truth or not.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so when you were kind of transcribing these interviews that you'd had with family, were there moments when it felt like there were parts that fit the narrative in a way where you felt inclined to want to embellish or want to sort of add an adjoinder to what was strictly said, or did you really keep the material to only those things which were actually physically communicated to you.
I think I need to elaborate. You have a
Mm,
body of work, and there might be inconsistencies or narratives that are 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 n not universally received.
mm,
But the point I want to make is that it depends on that point of view. It could be the same incidents, but different characters would have a different memories
mm.
or I don't know if you young men and saw the movie Rashomon. There,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
yeah. All
Love
right.
Rashomon. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they had three different perspectives.
Hmm.
Whose tooth do you? Is it a true for one narrator is not true for another narrator. So, uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So I try to make sure that uh, what I write is the in my point of view the truth, especially writing a memoir,
Mm.
embellish a memoir or lie in memoir. It's my point of view.
That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
Um, that makes a lot of sense. That's an important thing to caveat with everything. You know, there are many ways of seeing these particular sets of events, and this is the lens through which I am experiencing them. Absolutely. Are there parts, this is kind of the last question that we've received from the audience, but are there parts of the memoir that you had written and later on in the process of revision decided, I might want to scrap that part. It doesn't, there's sort of an incongruity with the rest of the narrative. If there are, one, kind of story or sort of instance or experience that you can recall sort of excising from what became the eventual manuscript, and maybe kind of why you chose to take that one out. Well, we can start with Glenn again.
As you know, Daniel, you worked with a big five publisher. When you write a book, there is just a lot that you want to stick in there. And like they say, kill your darlings,
That's right.
a lot ended up on the chopping room floor. And if anything, I probably put in too much. But I was just like, I have to retain this. The good thing though is you can find the stuff that you have to cut, you can find ways to use it in other ways. You can write
That's right.
essays, you can include it in future content. It is hard though, because ultimately your job as a writer is to write for the audience and
Mm.
not to bore them. But it is, these editorial choices are excruciating.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said. And I certainly can attest to all of that as well. Joanna, what about you? Were there, specific instances that you felt like this it didn't make it into the final version?
You're talking about the writing process, and mine was sort of. It was a long process. I first is just journaling, and then whenever uh, I saw in, like, for example, when Barack Obama and his family adopted a, dog, then I said, well, I had a pet too. And then I would write about my pet. The pets just happened to be a rat and a couple of chickens, but they were still
Mm,
my pets and so on. But then I switched to, so then it became vignettes, but then people say you got to do a regular kind of story, beginning, middle, and ending, and then so I switched to all those things and see where those things would fit, and finally found a structure that I
mm,
I, I like. So I don't know the only painful thing that I remember is I wrote a epilogue, and and one of my best mentor says that you should take that away. And
Mm,
yeah, and
interesting.
so yeah, so I didn't have any problems with excising things.
Mm. Well, I hope that epilogue resurfaces in this new work that you're crafting now, Joanna. I'm sure we would all really benefit from reading it. Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you so much, Glenn. It's been such a privilege to be able to speak with you both this evening, and thank you all so much for joining us. Really looking forward to the next chance to connect on both of your incredible work. So please, I hope you do keep in touch. And keep thinking of Serica as you keep writing and keep telling these important stories that need to be told.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
And
My
thank you
pleasure.
to the audience, wherever you are.
Thank you to the audience. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.